And many people don't know that I grew up in the Catholic tradition. And I went to Catholic school my entire life, and I wanted to be a nun. And when it came time in my senior year of high school for us to determine if we're going to take vows or do something else with life, I said that, you know what, instead of being a nun, I wanted to be a lawyer. Because I wanted to be a lawyer since 2nd grade. And instead of taking vows, I went on to college and law school and started practicing law. But I have always wanted to be a deacon. Okay? Always wanted to give sermons because I love studying and I love God. And so today it was really interesting because I had the address wrong and I went to 3000 West Gregory and said East Gregory. And so even though I came on 71, it took me twice as long to get here. But I am grateful that I got to hear the piece of the sermon from the pastor because he talked about the book of Matthew. And this is the first time in a long time that I'm addressing a church. And I did a little bit of research and reflection this morning, and in my spirit, God told me research the word peace in the Bible, in the New Testament. And so I took a little bit of time this morning before I came, and the word peace is mentioned by Jesus 49 times in the New Testament. And since we're talking about the book of Matthew, I studied the book of Matthew by coincidence, maybe in solidarity with the spirit of the pastor this morning. And I looked at the entire 28 chapters in the book of Matthew. And Jesus only mentions the word peace 3 times. And so the book of Matthew, in 28 chapters, when you go through it, Jesus is baptized in the 3rd chapter. In the 4th chapter, he is tested in the wilderness, and he picks his 12 apostles. And the first time he mentions the word peace is on the Sermon on the Mount in the Beatitudes in chapter 5. And so he says, "Blessed be the peacemakers, for they are the children of God." That is early on in that chapter. Remember, there are 28 chapters. He said that in the 5th chapter. And he was talking to a multitude at that time. Now, the second time he uses the word peace, because remember, he only uses it 3 times in that book. He uses it in the 10th chapter 2 times. Verse 13, when he is giving the direction to the 12 apostles before he sends them out in evangelism. He says, "If the home is deserving, let your peace resit on it. Resit on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you." And he treats peace as a blessing. So in the first time he mentioned peace, be peacemakers, he says it as an action early on in the book. But the second time he mentions it, he says it as a blessing. The third and the last time he mentions the word peace is in verse 34. "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Come on. And so he said, the last time he mentions the word peace in the book of Matthew, when he gives directions to the apostles, when he is sending them out across the land in evangelism, he said, "Make no mistake, I did not come here for peace. I came here to bring a sword." And so you've been hearing me talk, if you have been on the ground, if you have been in the resistance for black liberation in Kansas City, if you have been here all across the region in Kansas and Missouri, I'm talking about fear and courage being the 2 most powerful weapons of our adversaries. And where did that fear and confusion come from? Because I told you that it was 49 times that Jesus talked about peace. And he talked about it in 3 different ways. Remember, I told you that he said it as an action early on in his sermons, when he was talking to the multitude. Then when he imparted the word peace again to his 12 apostles, he used it as a blessing. And you see that manifested in Luke and in John when they say, "Go in peace." That is inner peace. After Jesus had already healed the people of disease, after he had created a miracle, after he had manifested his godliness inside of them, he said, now go in peace. He is talking about inner peace. He is talking about inner peace in those people, but he did not say, again, to be peacemakers. And so when we go to the book of Matthew, because this is my favorite book in the New Testament. And so we see Jesus get more and more radicalized. He talks about the Beatitudes with his first major sermon. And then he sends out his apostles with that edict that he did not come to be a peacemaker, he did not come to bring peace. Then in chapter 21, he acts in violence. He goes into the temple, he turns over the table. In some depictions, he takes a whip and he whips the merchants and says, you need to get in order in my father's house. He comes in violence to bring order. That is in the Bible. Then in chapter 27, actually, we're going to go back, chapter 21. For the first time, he curses something. He curses a fig tree and makes it wither. That's the first time we're seeing in Matthew that he actually curses something. We've always been seeing him as this person that creates miracles, that creates things. He's a creator. He is manifesting that creation spirit. But in chapter 21, he curses a fig tree and makes it wither because there is no fruit on that tree. Then in chapter 27, he models being sentenced by the Roman government, the corrupt Roman government, Pontius Pilate, that had been paid off by the Pharisees. And then he was executed by the Roman police state. In the last chapter, in the book of Matthew, he gives the charge. And the last thing that is mentioned, chapter 28, verse 20, he says, surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And so when we are talking about the spirit of our evangelism, we're not talking about compliance and obedience in the face of murder. When we're talking about fear, we have to go back to the roots of Christianity in the black community. And I'm going to speak on in the house of God. Because we did not start out as African people worshiping Jesus. We have to understand where that came from. And I was raised in the Catholic tradition. And I'm speaking to you after reading the book of Matthew, and I told you that was my favorite book of the New Testament. Fear has confused us for so long because our masters gave us Christianity to keep us obedient and docile. And they gave it to illiterate slaves. They didn't read us all of the chapters of the Bible. They only read us the pieces that kept us enslaved, that kept us obedient, that kept us as slaves, that kept us grateful to have masters. You have to know your history. That is a Jehovah. And so what God allowed to be in the earth for evil, he sets us up for our benefit. And so now that we are no longer illiterate, we have to know what is the Christian tradition. And the Christian tradition is radical tradition. It is a tradition of not having fear because he sent the apostles out with a sword in dangerous territory. John 16:33. It says, I told you these things so that in me you may have peace, inner peace. He's talking about this inner peace. In this world you will have trouble. Yes, sir. I've been arrested twice. Once while I was clearly marked as a return in Overland Park. The other time they knew I was Stacy because I had been down at the plaza 2 days before. That's called good trouble. Yes, come on. That's called good trouble. Because God says in the world there will be trouble. He didn't say there would be peace. Yeah, come on now. And so when we're the liberation of people that look like me.
Well,
when we talk about fear, fear is such a powerful weapon because it keeps us enslaved.
yeah.
The reason why we were enslaved until 1865 was because house Negroes were scared to lose their little bit of position.
Well,
They were afraid to lose the good scraps from the table.
no.
Even in the face of being whipped, mutilated, taken advantage of,
Lord.
having babies when they didn't want to have babies. That did not look like that, looked like their oppressor. Even in the face of that oppression, they refused to liberate themselves. And you can see time after time in history where we ourselves frustrated our own liberation out of fear.
No.
Cornel West calls that niggerization. That's when that you get to a certain level, you get a little bit of comfort, a little bit of privilege, a little bit of money. You get out to Lee Summit, you get out to Overland Park, and you forget the people right here by your church. And you are afraid to fight. You're afraid to get out in the streets because you might get fired from your job. In the face of ethnicity, Black households have 10 times less net worth than white households. So you are afraid of losing your $200,000 house, but what if we were not oppressed? You would have a $2 million house. So what are you willing to sacrifice? We talk about work. We talk about what we should do, but what are you willing to sacrifice? How are you willing to overcome your fear for this resistance? And we talk about the second most powerful weapon that our adversaries have against us, and that's confusion. That's confusion. We're confused about what we are going to do, even in the face of clear direction. When the slaves were liberated by Moses, God gave them an 11-day journey. They were supposed to reach the land of milk and honey in 11 days. And how long did it take to get there? It took them wandering in confusion for 40 years. Because they were not obedient to what God told them to do. Because they were not obedient. And because Moses acted in a spirit of fear, God cursed Moses and said, you know what? I'm going to make your people wander and you will not see the promised land. So this fear and confusion have been used against black people for 401 years. And so when we're talking about dismantling, I have lots of focus groups, lots of study groups. And people say, Stacy, you still out there protesting. I would go out there protesting, but I might lose my job. It's kind of hot out there. I saw you get maced in the face a couple of times. I saw you get arrested. I'm not willing to risk that because you know I got something going on over here. That is the spirit that will keep us enslaved for another 400 years. And so when we are talking about movement and black liberation, do not get confused because that's what the enemy wants. They're saying, okay, I know that you're talking about Black Lives Matter, but what about black on black crime? That is confusion.
That's confusion. Come on.
That is confusion. Because the same white supremacy that is enforced by the police department, the same systemic racism that is held in place by the control of our bodies, by the militarization of city employees that are given badges and guns, that is the same racism that has killed our babies in the streets.
Yes, ma'am.
Because make no mistake, black engineers, black lawyers, and black doctors ain't going around doing drive-bys. They're not doing drive-bys in Lee Summit. So it's not about black people being more violent. It's not that we hate each other as black people. The ingredients for any violent community are the same. Poor education. They have been systematically defunding our public schools since Kay Barnes in the 90s. Google the Cordish deal. Google it.
Yeah.
And when you do, you need to start getting angry. Because that's an example of the systematic transfer of generational wealth in Kansas City.
That's it. That's it.
The second ingredient is lack of jobs. They've been defunding our public schools. There are no real jobs in the inner city. They have not invested in infrastructure that would allow for public transportation. Besides the tourist attraction of that tram that goes downtown and to the Union Station for people that already have money and already have a car. Y'all ain't hearing me? And so the tools that create violence have been systematically placed east of truth for generations. And those same weapons are being used against us when police, militarized police, are roaming our streets every single day. You don't go to Leawood and see police roaming the streets every 10 minutes.
No, you don't.
You don't see their children being pulled over, pulled out of the car, their faces being beat into the ground until their teeth are broken out. You don't see that in Leawood.
Amen.
So why do you accept that in your streets?
Well, not accept.
So when we're saying we're not going to accept it, love is not a feel-good emotion. And when I talked to the pastor, I said I might have a song in my heart. But yesterday, Chief Rick Smith showed up to 31st and Truth and took a photo opportunity in front of the mural that said Black Lives Matter. And I knocked the song out my mouth. And it put some other words in my mouth that I can't use in the house of God. Because there is no end. There is no end to the corruption, the moral aptitude, the lack of moral compass, the brutality, and the lack of care that we have seen from our local political leadership, from our governor, from our mayor, from our city council, that expects us to just take whatever they give us. So when we say we are not going to take it, what you going to do?
Well,
When you say that you're not going to take it, how are you going to resist? When are you getting in the streets? When are you going to write your letter? When are you going to write your email? When are you going to do a sit-in? When are you going to be in a protest? When are you going to make that phone call? When are you going to march into that HR office? When are you going to stand up when you see somebody being downtrodden? When are you going to have enough? I didn't come here to make you feel good. I didn't come here to get a trophy or a plaque or a popularity award. Because I need a lot of powerful enemies. And if you are fighting for liberation, and make no mistake, I see white brothers and sisters. I see black and brown brothers and sisters. Black liberation is at the central of liberation of all people.
yes it is.
You can't have liberation of all people without black liberation.
Come on.
It does not exist. So what are you going to do? How will you stop being afraid? Because as long as you are afraid, you can't imagine freedom. That's what kept us in bondage until white people decided it was enough. Because we could have, at any time, as slaves, decided that we had enough. And we could have gotten our own liberation. But it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln, a white man, a white abolitionist, decided to use the force, the money, the resources, the body of the Union to liberate us. And this is 2020. When are you going to get off your knees begging for somebody to deliver you? Faith without works is dead. Jesus did not send out his apostles to pray with folks. He didn't put them on their knees begging for deliverance. He put them to work. And so your prayers should be used for your courage. Not begging for God to come down from heaven tomorrow and save you and your babies. They should be used for your vigor, for your inspiration, for your wisdom, for your courage, and for your strength. Because the Civil Rights Movement was 1954 to 1968. We've only been out in the streets 14 weeks. We got a long fight ahead of us.
Amen.
And we should not get out of the streets until we have our liberation.
Amen.
Because they got out of the streets in 1968. They thought that some of the civil rights, that was enough to be liberated. We want complete liberation.
Amen.
We want complete equality. We want complete equity. That is a promise upon which we built America. And when they gave us our freedom, they promised us reparations. They promised to make it right. They promised to make us equal. And that check has bounced for centuries. And I've asked you now 3 times, and I'm going to ask you one last time. What you gonna do?
All right.
All right now.
All right.
What you gonna do? Today, at 12:30 at 63rd in Brookside, there's a march held by Southeast Unity. A lot of us are not gonna make it, but that's an example of continued resistance. And so if you're on Facebook, if you're on social media, I need you to start doing some digging. How you can get involved, who you need to email, whose desk you need to go sit on. I said it. Whose desk you might need to go sit on until they meet some demands. Because the first demand is to fire Chief Rick Smith. The reason why he needs to be fired is because just like your pastor said, there have been men that have been ripped from this community and from their families. And do you know what Chief Rick Smith did? He has obstructed justice. That's what your Jackson County prosecutor has told you. Many times obstructed justice so that the police officers that have murdered our brothers could not be held accountable. That is not the mark of a leader. I've got some babies in town from St. Louis, my nieces, the oldest who are 11, and I had them on Facebook Live last night behind the camera, and I told them, what do you think should happen to the chief of police if his officers that he's in charge of murder people in the streets? And an 11-year-old said that he should get demoted. An 11-year-old. So how come my 11-year-old nieces that live in St. Louis that ain't never heard of Chief Rick Smith, have never heard of Cameron Lamb or Terrence Bridges or Ryan Stokes, how come they have enough sense to get rid of the chief of police? And we're allowing him to stay in his position. That is confusion. That is not an order. And so I'm going to leave you today, and hopefully I made some people mad. Hopefully I got some funky looks up in the audience.